Hey there, Death Squad, Manuel here. In this video, we are going to talk about texturing the asset that we've been building so far. For this purpose, we are going to be using a program called Substance Painter. If you've been around any 3D workflow, you know that this is a very popular program, and this is one of the programs that I'll be using on all of my tutorials for texturing purposes, just because it's so good. It has so many tools and so many options that you cannot get on some other programs. Alright, let's get started. Now, when you open Substance Painter, if you're here on Windows 10, you more than likely are going to get this message no matter what kind of GPU you have. Even when I have my 2080 Ti, I still get this error. This isn't so much of an error, more of like a warning. You can just click here to not show it again. What it's telling you is your current TDR, timeout texture recovery, is too low. This is what tells Windows, hey, if this is taking this much to render, then just crash the drivers, because that's pretty much what it does. It doesn't say crash the driver, but it pretty much closes any program that you haven't said the driver has just crashed. So if you have a lower end GPU, you may want to go into this instructions right here, just so you can fix the registry. This is something very delicate, so there's a small warning here. Modifying your registry, it's something a little bit advanced. That being said, if you are having problems with Substance Painter crashing and you still get this, then they have a step-by-step guide that if you click here, it will straight up take you into this website that you're seeing right now. So once you finish this and you go back to Substance Painter, it should not give you this message again. That being said, I've never had any crashing problems, so I'm just going to click this one right here and say continue anyway. Okay, now that we're here in Substance, in order to show you about the program, as you can see, if I go here, there's a lot of stuff that's grayed out because I don't have a project loaded. So let's load one. First thing you should do whenever you get into Substance Painter is click on File, New. And over here, you're going to get this dialog for a new project. Now, we're not going to check this because we're not using UDIM tiles, as I mentioned before. This is something a little bit more advanced. Project settings, you can set here the resolution you want. That being said, this can also be changed once you end your session and once you want to export your textures out. So I'm just going to keep the 2048. For the normal map format, OpenGL and DirectX, which are the two options that you have right here, they just have a different type of normal map coloring. So OpenGL is just the opposite of DirectX in terms of what's up and what's down. In this case, we're going to choose DirectX because we're going to be building for Unreal. Anything that you build for Unreal Engine should be on DirectX. If you were building something for Unity, you would choose OpenGL, but this asset will be for Unreal in particular. So let's go to File, and I'm going to select my asset. And here I am in the Explorer window that you're going to get once you press that. And I'm going to select this one, which is the lamp that I already unwrapped. And we don't have any maps. These options are only if you have baked other maps in a different software. We're going to talk about baking very soon, but because we don't have any other baked maps, we're not going to add anything here. We'll just click OK. Alright, so as you can see, it just loaded our asset in the 3D viewport. And if I were to go to over here, you're going to see that I have different options and I have more stuff to talk about. So let's go through a couple of things. Like every other program, this Substance Painter has File, Edit, where you can change project settings, project configuration, and here you can save. There's the Export Textures. In Window, Views, it contains all the things that you're seeing right here. So let's say if I were to click that out and I want to recover it, one way to do it is go here, Views, and get my shelf back. So if you don't have this, just go to Windows Views, and you'll see it right there. Now over here we have different types of things. If you still have the default view, You may have other features here. I just clicked on the X and deleted them because you can always get them from this side over here, and I'd rather have them populated on this side than to have them all over the place over here taking space. And this is done by default. You don't have to do this. This comes with the program. So let's keep talking about the interfaces of Substance Painter. This right here is your viewport, just like any other 3D program. The only difference is that you can switch your viewport from being fully 3D to being 2D only, which shows your UV maps, to being 2D, 3D. And if I need to see the 2D view, I'll most notably switch to this view so I can see simultaneously what is going on. Now next to this, it's this little cube right here. It's called perspective and orthographic. Just like I talked in the introduction to the modeling portion, we're going to have a perspective view, which is what you're seeing here, and we're also going to have an orthographic view, which you're seeing right here. Our orthographic view is so you can see the straight front, the straight side, the straight top, and so on and so forth. What I'm doing to snap every single view is hold shift. So if I wanted to rotate, as you can see, I need to hold alt, and once you hold alt, you get this dialog over here that's going to tell you what the camera can do while you are holding alt. So alt plus shift will snap our camera to those sides. Okay, I much rather be in the perspective view because this will give me a much better view of what's going on. And for zooming in and out, basically it's just the mouse wheel. If I wanted to pan, I'll use the middle mouse button. In my case, I'm not using the mouse. If I'm here, I'm usually using my stylus. So that would be one of the buttons on my stylus, but for panning, it's just clicking on the middle mouse button. I also do this for zooming in and out with my stylus. It's very handy. And just by the way, you don't have to have a Wacom tablet or a Huion tablet or whatever brand you prefer, but I would suggest that you have any kind of drawing tablet. That would really help because you're going to see that we're going to be doing some strokes over here. And just like in Photoshop, this program can be dependent on the pen pressure. So if you have a drawing tablet, you can configure some pen pressure to it, and that way you can apply your brushes in a different way, because a mouse will just add your pen pressure 100% all the time unless you move some settings over here. Alright, now this is the viewport, and over here we have these parts which just tell us about the brush, which we already have over here, but let's keep talking about the interface before we get into brushes. Now here I have my layers. My layers is what I'm going to be painting on pretty much, and this works exactly like Photoshop. It works exactly like Photoshop. It even has the blending modes that Photoshop has and a little bit more of them, which we'll probably use depending on what kind of textures I decide to apply. Now if I go here, properties, we have the brush, which we have size, flow meaning how hard or how soft your brush is. So if I turn down the flow, you can see that my brush is a little bit more transparent on the outside than on the inside. If I go all the way down, you can see my brush is a little bit more defined. Opacity, very self-explanatory. The more opaque something is, the more it's going to show. Opacity works from 0 to 100. 100% means fully opaque. 0 means it's not going to show. The spacing, this works in certain brushes that have a particular type of texture. The angle, again, this works for very specific brushes that we're going to see later on. And let's keep going down. Now these are a little bit of a more advanced tools for painting. I am, however, going to keep to the basic stuff in this tutorial. So we're not going to touch some of these options, and other options I'll just show you along the way while I'm painting, because otherwise this introduction is going to be way too long. Now if I go here, we have the material portion of the properties. So we have color, we have metalness, because we're dealing with the PBR workflow. PBR means physically based rendering, and that means that instead of spec gloss, if you've ever seen the old workflow, that's what they used to use before, was spec and gloss. Now we're used to using metal and roughness, which you'll find a lot in Unreal Engine. We also have a normal map, and we have our height, which kind of works like the normal map in some regard. Okay, now let's go here to the shelf. This is another important piece that we're going to be using a lot. So you'll find, and let's talk about the basic stuff that we're going to be using in this tutorial, is the brushes. So let me see the brushes right here. We have a ton of different brushes to choose from. You'll see me using some particular brushes just to finish it off and give this lamp a little bit more detail. But you have several different types of brushes to choose from, and all of the brushes that I have here come default with the program, so I haven't downloaded anything from any external sources. Another thing that we're going to be using here is procedurals. So we have procedurals and grunges, which is kind of the same thing. The grunges are also procedural maps, and the way that these works is these are seamless maps that can be tiled an infinite amount of numbers. That being said, these procedural and grunge maps can react to certain baked maps. Those certain baked maps are the ones that are going to be doing up next, but for now know that we need to bake some maps in order to take advantage of these procedural and grunge maps. You can use them the way they are. However, they have some parameters in them that will allow them to take advantage of those big maps, and your model will look so much better. Okay, let's talk about this column right here, because it's something that I'm going to talk about a lot in this tutorial. If we go into the first one, you're going to see that we have our texture set list. In this case, we don't have more than one texture set, but in future tutorials, if you see there's more than one name here, that means that we have more than one texture set. And I sometimes use that for characters to define very specific parts of the body that I want to have more resolution or not. In this case, we have just one texture set, which we can always rename to lamp textures. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And I'll keep it that way. Now the second one are your texture settings. So as you can see, we have channels RGB, we have the metallic, we have roughness, we have normal and height. Let's do this now that we are in here. We're going to add another channel, another one that's very important for a lamp. It's going to be the emissive map, emissive channel. So we click here, and we're going to talk about that later on, but now that we're here, all you have to do is go to the plus sign and add your emissive. It's no longer here because I already added. Okay, you don't have to mess with these numbers. Normal mixing, combine, that's fine. I always leave this in its default, and then we have our bake mesh maps button and the mesh maps. So over here, if you have baked in another program, you can select the normal maps and just throw them in here. You can actually drag and drop them, and you can add them here. That being said, we don't have a high poly. The high poly to low poly workflow, it's something that I will be showing in another tutorial. However, some of these maps are just depending on coordinates and positions in the universe. So we don't need a high poly mesh in order to bake them. We can take advantage of those baked maps with our procedurals without the need of a high poly mesh. So I'm just going to click here, now that we're in this space, just to talk about the bake map dialog. Now you can see just straight up in here that we have an option to use our low poly mesh as high poly. So all I have to do is check here, and what I'll do is it won't look for a second source, it won't look for a high poly, it will just do the baking within our low poly mesh. Now I'm going to go into my whiteboard right now so I can show you a little bit of concepts of baking maps. Alright, let's talk about the concept of baking, and it is what it sounds like baking is pretty much, it's like baking a cake. And the reason why we chose that term is because, let's say I have a high poly here and I have a low poly here, and this high poly has a bunch of detail. Now what I'm going to do is pretty much bake or project all of that high detail into my low poly. That's why they call them bake, because it's like when they paint those old vases, those artisan vases made of clay. What they do is they paint them up and they put it in an oven, and that paint gets baked in the clay. So that's pretty much what it does. And if you want to go to like a more modern example, sometimes when they are painting certain parts and they want to really, like parts for cars maybe, yeah, something like that, and they want to really have that paint be embedded into the item, they'll put that paint in an oven and they will bake it, and then that paint will be on top of that forever. So that's pretty much what they call it, baking. What we are trying to do right now is we're not going to be using a high poly, we're going to be using a low poly, but the concept applies. So let's say we have our low poly here, giant low poly, put an L here. Now what the baker is going to do, or whatever program you're using, is it's going to encase our low poly into a cage. That's why you'll see an option in Substance Painter that would allow you to have a cage if you've already constructed a cage in another program, but it will create a cage for you. And the purpose of this cage is so it envelopes the whole low poly model and it starts shooting rays all over it. Alright, so these rays are going to start detecting, if you have a high poly, these rays are going to start detecting those details and are going to start projecting those details into a 2D texture. And those details can be translated into a normal map, ambient occlusion, cavity map, curvature, position, world space normal, and ID map, which are the ones that you're going to see in Substance Painter. There are others that I use that go into other bakers, so but these are the basic ones. So if we were to have a high poly object that we had already some detail and we wanted to transfer it to our low poly, then we will be baking a normal map. However, we're not going to be using a high poly for this tutorial, so we will be baking other maps like ambient occlusion. And ambient occlusion, what it is, if you haven't heard the term before, is that little small line of shadow that is created when two surfaces are in contact. So if I were to go and have something like this, it will be like the shadow that's created over here when this, let's say this L is making contact with the floor. The little shadow that's created underneath it is going to be called the ambient occlusion. Now we usually don't see this in real life, but it is there. I can guarantee you it is there. And when it's not in CGI, you can tell it's not there. So if I were to not have ambient occlusion, and you can see this in games of old, like in PS1 games, when we didn't have ambient occlusion, things looked like they were floating. Even though they were on top of other things, they looked like they were floating. So this is an effect that we use to kind of like ground the objects, if you want to call it that. So to make the scene a lot more real, to make it look like the objects are actually on top of something else and are not like floating in space. Alright, wow, this is a terrible example. Okay, then we have the cavity map, which is something that we can extract from the ambient occlusion. We're not going to touch that here. We have the curvature, which is something we're going to be baking here, and what the curvature does, it detects where the edges that are coming out of the object are, and it also detects the edges that are coming in, and it transforms that into a 2D map. So this is also useful for the procedural maps. Position, this just tells the program what are the coordinates of our object. So what is up, what is down, what is right, what is left, and where it is located. World space normal is a little bit more complicated. So imagine a normal map with a ton of colors, which is what you're going to see, and the world space normal not only tells the program where those details are, but it tells them how those details will look. So what this does, it projects a normal map plus position. So you'll see a bunch of colors in this one. We are actually going to bake one, even though we don't have any high poly with detail. We are going to bake this because this will help some of our procedural maps. And finally, an ID map, which we're not going to bake because we don't have a high poly model. This is usually done if you have a high poly model that has several meshes within one mesh. So let's say I have a character has hair, has eyes, has clothing, a belt, shoes, all of that. Then I can add different color IDs to the high poly, and that will be transferred into the low poly in order for me not to be masking whenever I'm working in Substance Painter. It will make my life a lot easier if I had an ID map. However, we don't have a high poly, so we're not gonna need this, and yeah, those are the ones we're not gonna use here.
This video was made possible by my supporters on Patreon. If you want more videos like this, check out my Patreon page using the link in the description. To stay up to date on new releases, make sure you follow us on social media.